Hi, this is Don Forsyth, speaking to you of groups and group dynamics. This is the second installment of an analysis of leadership. Earlier, we spoke of the idea that to understand leadership, you truly need to understand group dynamics. For even though in many cases leaders influence people across great distances, in most cases leaders do their work within small groups. And to be effective as a leader, you should understand groups and their dynamics. The topic I'd like to discuss in this segment is leadership emergence. I think it's critically important to distinguish between who becomes the leader of the group, who will the group select as the leader, and who will they respond to in that role, versus how effective will that individual be, because oftentimes very different processes, different variables influence these two outcomes. It may be the case that the individual who would be the most effective as leader is not selected to be the group's leader because they simply do not emerge. They do not have the skills, the characteristics, the processes are not in place so that the group is unable to recognize that within their midst is the individual who is most able to help them succeed. And yet they end up selecting, in some cases, an individual who is less proficient, who doesn't have the same level of skills and abilities to perform effectively in the leadership role. Leadership emergence is a very complex topic. It's got many aspects to it. I'll break it down into just two categories. First, we'll review very quickly some of the skills and qualities and characteristics of people who frequently emerge as leaders. And then we'll talk about a few of the theories of leadership emergence which bring order to those empirical findings. To get started, who will lead in a group situation? We need to think about, for example, the personality of the leader, the competencies of the leader, how much the individual is involved in the group. All those variables are critically important. We can put it in context by contrasting Thomas Carlyle's great leader theory, as we might wish to update it. He, of course, called it the great man theory, versus Leo Tolstoy, the historian's more zeitgeist approach to explaining who will lead and who will follow. Carlyle, the historian, of course, stressed the idea that the history of the world is created by people, single individuals who have a significant impact on history and the world's outcomes. Tolstoy took a different viewpoint. He suggested that perhaps what depends most is the spirit of the times, that certain situations call for leaders to emerge, but it's not the characteristics of those individuals which is so important. It's the situation which is propitious for creating the circumstances where a single individual can have a great impact on others. This is summarized within group dynamics perhaps best by Kurt Lewin's law of, if you will, of leadership and behavior in general, the interactional model, which suggests that behavior is, to understand behavior, you have to take into account the person, the people, both the leader and the followers, and the environment, the context in which they lead. So we don't want to ignore, of course, personality characteristics. Those are critically important, the P element in Lewin's formula, but you also have to take into account the context. So certain individuals with certain qualities will emerge depending upon the circumstances. Researchers have identified a number of personality traits and characteristics associated with leadership. In the early days of leadership research, people were disappointed that personality tended to be a relatively poor predictor of leadership outcomes. But in the textbook in table 9-3, which is on page 288, there's a fairly substantial list of personality characteristics which are reliably associated with emergence as leadership. Such characteristics as assertiveness, authenticity, even birth order, character strengths, dominance, gender, for example, narcissism, self-efficacy, self-monitoring, social motivation tendencies, all those are linked up with the tendency to emerge as a leader, at least in a small group context. Some of these findings, particularly those pertaining to the Big Five personality model, as you are probably very aware, the researchers have gravitated to the idea that there are five very important characteristics that can be used to describe individual differences in personality, and those are extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, stability, also referred to as neuroticism in some cases, and openness to new experiences. And as I suggested, you have to take into account the difference between emergence as the leader versus effectiveness of the leader. Meta-analytic findings suggest that conscientiousness and extroversion are strong influence on emergence as leaders. So group members apparently are impressed by someone who is socially motivated and is also focused on the task to be done, perhaps suggesting that leadership is based on a task orientation and a relationship orientation. The factors following that up are stability and openness. Oddly, agreeableness overall is the weakest predictor of emergence. However, when we turn to effectiveness, we see that agreeability becomes much stronger. In fact, most of the big five personality characteristics are associated at the 0.2 and slightly above level with effectiveness of leader, although conscientious falls behind just a bit. Competencies of leader, what are they good at? What are their skills and abilities? Certainly there are certain skills a leader must have. Researchers have focused on two forms of intelligence, both intellectual, analytic intelligence, as well as emotional intelligence, which for some includes not just understanding and being able to control one's own emotions, but also understanding others' emotions as well. Work on participation to slightly correct a small misunderstanding that's in the literature regarding who emerges as leaders. For quite a while, the idea was that the Babel effect held within groups. What that means is that the person who talks the most tends to emerge as the leader of a group, even if what they are saying is not all that relevant to the task at hand, or even helpful to the group in its work. There were a number of studies looking at this Babel effect process, and they consistently suggested that talking a lot will get you high status within a group. And I would agree that it is the case that if you say very little within the group, you probably will be disqualified from a high status position within that group. However, more recent work by Jones and Kelly suggests that group members are sensitive to the quality of what is said. And when they conducted a study in which they carefully designed both the quantity variable and the quality variable so they were equal in strength, they found that group members did, when comments were of low quality, they did favor low quantity. They did favor a high quality, an individual who made high quality comments versus an individual who made low quality comments. This also held when quantity of comments were very high. So the individual who emerged most frequently as the leader within the group and is recognized as the best leader was the individual who made not just a lot of comments, but comments of very high quality. So they suggest that talking regularly, but saying things that are relevant to the task the group is working on is the key to being selected as the group member. The leaders look, there are many demographic characteristics of individuals that are linked to leadership success. It is true that leaders tend to be older, they tend to be taller, they tend to be heavier, they tend to be healthier. Also members of minority groups, ethnic minorities, racial minorities tend to be less likely to emerge as a leader in groups of mixed minorities and mixed ethnicities and race. And also there continues to be a tendency for women to have a more difficult time to emerge as leaders of groups relative to men. The very well-known phrase, the glass ceiling, is often used to describe this phenomenon, suggesting that as women do move up in status within the group, they frequently reach a point where they're disqualified from the highest status positions within the groups, the higher level leadership positions. It's as if there's a glass ceiling blocking their access to that. Dr. Egley refers to the glass ceiling, and she believes a better analogy is the leadership labyrinth, whereas it's just more difficult for women to maneuver their way through the maze leading from followership to taking the leader than it is for a man. This tendency is supported by a number of psychological and social and organizational factors, but it remains ironic because our earlier look at the skills and abilities of men and women suggests that women are very strong in both task-related skill and relationship-related skills. Dr. Egley's work, in fact, suggests that women tend to be quite strong in transformational leadership skills. And also we saw earlier that when individuals respond to leaders, they are more positive towards relationship-oriented leaders. Yet in spite of all that, men have an easier time emerging as leaders relative to women. There are a number of theories which try to explain the leadership emergence process. We're already 11 minutes into this presentation, so I can only give a very brief overview of those, and I refer you instead to the text's analysis of these theories, which begins on page 294 of the text. But 5 theories that I should mention: implicit leadership, social identity theory, social role theory, terror management theory, and evolutionary theory. All of these theories explain to some degree some aspect of leadership emergence in groups. Implicit leadership theory suggests that most individuals, laypersons, followers alike, they have an intuitive conception of what it takes to be effective as a leader. Robert Lord defined this as an implicit leadership theory. Implicit because it's not always recognized. It's tacit knowledge rather than explicit knowledge. And it's a theory in the sense that it's general principles that people intuitively rely upon when understanding leadership and when recognizing leadership. And the basic idea is that when an individual matches well the implicit leadership theories of followers, they are more likely to emerge as the leader. So if, for example, the group members' implicit leadership theories stress friendliness, relationship-oriented leadership, then a socio-emotional leader who matches that will be evaluated more positively than will a task-oriented leadership. This implicit leadership theory has also been examined by the Globe researchers, examining worldwide conceptions of leaders and leadership. And they find that across many cultures, consistently, there's certain characteristics that people expect leaders to display. And when leaders display those characteristics, they are more likely to emerge as the leader, and in part they're probably more effective as the leader, since leadership is, to some extent, in the eye of the beholder. I'll emphasize, of course, that many of these characteristics focus on skills and abilities working in small groups and teams. Social identity theory adds to this idea that leaders need to be prototypical for the groups which they lead. As this theory suggests, individuals look to the group to define who they are. Their identity is not just based on personal characteristics, but also the characteristics of the groups to which they belong. In general, group members feel that leaders should be prototypical of their group, and they'd be more likely to support a leader who matches that prototype. So the more a leader displays characteristics which were unusual for their group, the less likely they'll emerge as a leader, and the more difficult they'll have influencing people. Dr. Egley and her colleagues have offered up social role theory, which just suggests that there's 2 fundamental roles associated with success in groups. They tend to focus on task and relationship, or the terms presented here are agency versus a communal tendency. Individuals in many cultures generally think that there is a difference between men and women and their capacity to engage in these 2 forms of behavior. So sex role stereotypes suggest that men act in masculine ways, which are more consistent with agency, and women, sex role stereotypes suggest that women tend to be more communal rather than agency. However, add that to people's implicit leadership theories, they do suggest that they associate agency more with leadership and communal tendencies with less leadership. and therefore there's a tendency for men to be favored in groups rather than women. Terror management theory has offered a more recent explanation for who emerges as leader and who will be supported, and this is the idea that humans, rather uniquely, are aware, existentially aware of their ultimate demise, and that in many cases people, well, they simply try not to think that they will ultimately die someday, but aspects of the situation can remind them of their mortality and making mortality salient. When mortality salience is high, individuals respond to that in various ways. They tend to bolster their self-esteem. They would prefer that their worldview be confirmed. And so they'd be more likely to select a leader who confirms their worldview. And researchers Cohen, Solomon, Maxfield, and Pazinski and Greenberg in this particular study found fairly strong evidence that a charismatic leader will be most supported when mortality is salient rather than when it's not salient. So they experimentally, for some subjects, reminded them of their ultimate demise, creating mortality salience, and then they had them evaluate charismatic leaders, and they certainly found an increase in supportiveness for a charismatic leader than in the condition when mortality was salient. Task-oriented leadership, however, was generally rated more positively than charismatic leader, and it didn't matter if mortality was salient or not. Evolutionary theory, just to mention a final one, is of course goes back to Charles Darwin's idea that groups and living in group is a survival strategy, and in many cases, if our groups are led by an individual who is competent, who is skilled, it gains us in terms of our overall evolutionary fitness. So therefore, followers, human beings in general, are naturally ready, attuned to detect who is a leader, to recognize skill in another individual as a leader, but also to not be completely trusting in those who lead us, and to be ready to replace a leader as might be. So evolutionary perspectives identify reasons why individuals will select certain individuals to be the leaders, particularly individuals who fit the tribe's characteristics. Van Voot and Spisak confirmed that tendency, finding that in particular when groups are in situations where they are confronting other groups, those groups tend to prefer men as leaders during intergroup conflict. When groups are experiencing periods of intra-group conflict, problems maintaining group cohesiveness, then group members would prefer a woman leader rather than a male leader, perhaps evolutionarily speaking, recognizing that women are superior in leadership relative to men. That was something of a whirlwind analysis of theories of leadership, but I'll wrap up this segment now, and in our final segment we'll turn to leadership effectiveness. Thank you as always for joining me.